The distance of travel from home, 100 years ago, it was 6 miles for an 8 or 9-year-old. Now, that's a long way for us now, right? 6 miles from home. Would you let your child go? Probably not. By 1970, it got down to 1 mile. 1990, it was half a mile. Now it's 300 yards or the end of the street.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Over the summer, we've been taking a look at the lives of our nation's children and young people, at both their attainment and their wellbeing. We've used this mini-series to ask, are the kids okay? We've explored everything from the early years, the school years, through to what happens after you're 16 and what is happening in broader family life. We've unpacked the government's Opportunity Mission, which is its pledge to break the link between a child's background and its future by tackling inequalities at every stage. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to that series yet, I suggest going back and catching up on those episodes first, because today we are doing something a little bit different. We are reflecting back on all of the ground that we've covered, and we're answering your questions. So we've had huge engagement with this series. We've had brilliant questions and comments via email, YouTube and on Mumsnet, and thank you to everyone who has engaged with what we've been doing. We've pulled out the questions that best reflect the issues that you're all discussing, and today I'm going to put those questions to our resident expert, Christine Farquharson, and I'm going to use my phone a friend and bring back the guests we've had along the way to ask them questions too. So just a quick disclaimer, we've edited the questions for length and clarity to make them podcast friendly, but these are the questions that people have been sending in to us. One of the discussions that listeners have been having that really resonates with me as a mum to 2 small children is around the role of nurseries versus young children staying at home with a parent or other family member. And we had a great question on the role of the government in that decision. So to look at that issue and some other early years issues, I'm rejoined by Carey Oppenheim, who is an expert in the early years at the Nuffield Foundation and a former special advisor to Prime Minister Tony Blair. So a big thank you, Carey, to coming back to join us. We had a question from Chanel Leher, who wrote to us saying, the discussion primarily considered policy options around childcare outside of the home, both as a way to aid child development for disadvantaged children and to help mothers return to work. An alternative approach would be to help mothers stay at home for the first 3 to 4 years of a child's life and support them with parenting skills, for example, reading at home or talking to children. This would avoid the problems associated with nursery care and improve readiness for school. Has there been any policy thinking about the option to support single-income families and the potential positive impact of helping mothers to stay at home for the early years of a child's life?
So, this is clearly a dilemma for public policy when it comes to parents with young children. And Chanel is right to say that we predominantly focused on early years and childcare provision. That reflects the fact that public policy has focused on that territory in terms of trying to expand the quantity of early years provision over the last 25 years. But that has been accompanied by also improvements in parental leave, paid parental leave, still predominantly focused on the mother, although you can share it. So there's always been a recognition that we need to think about both. And in our conversation, we did talk about the importance of what nursery or early education can do for you, but also the importance of the home learning environment. In terms of UK policy, I would say, because also there's a gender question here and women want to, not necessarily full time and the whole time, want to be able to retain their hold in the labour market. The emphasis has been on enabling women to go into work. So I would say the UK policy has not really focused on the question at hand, but there are other countries that have had policies which are more focused on enabling a parent, shall we say, to be at home in the early years, and the primary example of that is Finland, which has generally got a kind of strong policy on early childhood, where there is a home care payment for those parents who are not accessing early education and childcare. But there are, and I think it's really important to say this, there are some real downsides of that. So while it might enable greater choice, it means that children don't have the kind of benefits of quality early education and childcare where it exists, that they may lose touch with the labour market And we know that it's important for whether it's fathers or mothers, that it's important to retain a hold on the labour market, particularly if we're also concerned about poverty. And it's also, it's a key way of helping in relation to poverty. And also we know particularly, as the question acknowledges, that for disadvantaged children, it's even more important to have access to nursery education, or it might be with a childminder, whatever the setting. So it feels to me it's very likely that policy is likely to stay in that territory. There's been some interesting research that the LSE has done about what has most impact in terms of child outcomes. Are we talking about early education and childcare based systems, or are we talking about sort of care at home by the mother or parent? And it depends on how strong your childcare architecture is. So if you've got a good and universal, easy to access and quality early education and childcare system, then really there is not much benefit if we're talking about child outcomes in terms of extending, say, maternity pay and leave for very long periods. If it's very poor and unregulated, then being able to pay mothers or fathers to be at home does have benefits. So I think it's really important that this context is part of that conversation.
I think Carey makes some really important points there, and particularly around the role that policy has had in shaping these decisions. Actually, if you look at some of the policy priorities, like, for example, the requirements on parents who are claiming universal credit or other benefits, what we've actually seen is more and more encouragement to try and get those parents to go out and look for paid work, even when their children are younger. But stepping back, I think the bigger picture question here is that actually for a lot of parents and a lot of mothers, this isn't really an either I work or I look after my kids question. This is really about how families are combining those two things. The UK really stands out in international comparison for having a lot of mothers who are in paid work but working part-time hours. And so there's a pretty common pattern here, which is that maybe mum is doing 2 or 3 days a week of paid work, but also spending the rest of the time with her kids. Maybe dad is working a compressed week or working 80% of the time, and so he's got a day at home. Maybe grandma and grandpa are helping out, and then maybe there's a bit of time around informal childcare or in early education settings as well. So for a lot of families, those earliest years look like a bit of a patchwork of trying to come up with lots of different arrangements of care. I think there's one question around just how well is that working for families and how easy is it for them to navigate that. There's a second question around what's the best mix of those different environments for children. And I think we have, some evidence that suggests parental care can be really great, grandparental care can be good, formal childcare can be really great, and it's about getting the balance between those working well. But I think there's also another question there, which is that arrangement working well for particularly mothers when they look at their career as a whole? Because a quite disappointing or quite challenging fact is that the returns to working part-time are really very low. You earn lower wages, even once you strip out that you're working fewer hours, your hourly wage is lower, and you basically don't ever get a pay rise or a promotion is sort of the way that it works in the UK. And so you end up with these mothers who are still going out and are still taking on paid work, but are sort of locked out of that progression, which is the biggest contributor to the gender wage gap that we still have. So for me, when I look at that and I take a step back, I think that we've talked a lot on this episode about second chances and retraining. Often people don't think about that in terms of mothers. And actually, I think there is a really big missed opportunity to say there's a big cohort of people with really good skills who we really want to have actively contributing, who may choose or may feel that it's in the best interests of their family to take that step back for a few years. But what are we going to do to try and help them take that step forward again once the time is right for their families? And we think a lot about, targeted support for young people or targeted support for the long-term unemployed. I don't think that anybody has really tackled what does targeted support look like for the mum who took that step back but wants to go back into that job, that career that feels right for her when the time is right.
And that could mean many different things, right? I mean, that could mean getting back into whatever you were doing before you had children, but it could also mean taking a bit of a career change.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't necessarily mean going back to exactly how things were, but over a period of years, going back to something different. And I think you're right. I don't think we've had much discussion about, you have a child, it changes your life fundamentally. in some ways you keep a connection to the job market if you've got some part-time work. But yeah, how can you, if you want to at a later date when your children are grown up, for example, if you want to do something different, how can government support you back into that? Okay, so should we move on to schools? And to do that, the friend I'm going to phone now is Sam Freedman, who is Senior Fellow at the Institute for Government, a Senior Advisor to ARC Schools and a former Advisor to the Department of Education. So thank you, Sam, for coming back to join us.
No problem.
Sam, we had a question from Mark Jones, who wrote to say, my son is 12 and watches lots of semi-educational content on YouTube. How can the average teacher compete with this great content? Has free, engaging online content made it harder for schools? And should we rethink how education is delivered?
So the big thing that teachers can do, which online content can't, is see whether the pupils are engaged with the content. Now, there are kids who will lap up anything they can find in terms of great content online. Now, when I was a kid, I was a history nerd. I loved reading history books outside of school and learnt loads by doing that. But I was unusual. That isn't how most teenagers spend their time. And there has been a few big evaluations of this kind of online content. Probably the most famous is called Khan Academy. And there was a big evaluation of Khan Academy. And what it shows is that unsupervised, children just stop using it. Most children will just stop using it, and it doesn't therefore have any positive educational effect. So what you do need a teacher in a classroom engaging kids and making sure they are actually learning the content that they're supposed to be learning. And we're a very long way away from not requiring that. That doesn't mean you can't use this content to support in the classroom. To encourage children to watch outside, where you've got kids who are really enthused to encourage them to watch it. It's not that it hasn't got value, but it's not going to replace school anytime soon.
And so while I've got you, I want to abuse my position as host to ask you the question. I think earlier listeners will know that I've got myself a little bit obsessed with special educational needs and disabilities and how we can support those children. So there's one specific question. I mean, how can and should schools be supporting teachers to provide for children? What I have in mind is that reform might be coming down the track, but there are teachers in schools now dealing with children who have disabilities now. I mean, what can schools be doing to make things as good as they can be now?
I think firstly, you need to look at training. I think when I came on your program before, I said that the training for special educational needs is pretty poor for teachers at the moment. There's not very much content in the initial teacher training framework about special needs. So I think if we want a more inclusive mainstream education, we need to boost the amount of support of initial teacher training in SEND. But then you also can have professional development. That it can be very extensive, or can just be providing some additional support. And I think if the government go down the reform route they're thinking about, they will have to put quite a bit of money into training to support that. I think you also need to look at the use of classroom assistants, the use of equipment in schools. There is a lot of really good practice out there. There are schools that are really, really good at this. Again, a big part of what the government are going to have to look at is how do you get the expertise that is in some schools and allow other schools that maybe don't have so much practice in this space to learn from that. How do you use groups of schools in more effective ways to provide that kind of scaling of good practice, which is always a big problem in the education sector. So there are things you can do. There are things schools should be looking at. There's things government should be looking at. It's a really important part of any reform program if that happens.
So of course, what happens at school shapes the choices available after 16. And in our previous episode, we tried to elevate the importance of further education in the public debate. And in response, we've actually had quite a few questions about apprenticeships, including from the Edge Foundation and also from Susanna Todd, who wrote to say, I have 13 godchildren at various stages of life. I'm very impressed, Susanna, that's a lot of godchildren, with a range of backgrounds and abilities, and some had GCSE results this year. How can we encourage more firms, not just the big ones, but also smaller employers, to offer apprenticeships or sponsorships? The apprenticeship system isn't pervasive, and with the national insurance increase, it makes it look more expensive to many employers. And for that question, I'm going to turn to Philip Augar, who chaired the government's landmark review of post-education 18 and funding and was our special guest on the third episode. So welcome back, Philip. Thank you for joining us again. Philip, we started talking on the episode about the role of firms. I mean, how can the government encourage firms to want to offer apprenticeships to young people?
Yeah, it's an important question. And it's been a very messy territory for a long time, the whole apprenticeship field. There's sort of a kind of romantic element to the way people view apprenticeships, young people going off and studying trades while they're simultaneously working and emerging as skilled craftsmen. That's a rather romantic view that's very outdated compared to what actually happens now. And to be quite honest, for the last quarter of a century, this field has been very messy. There's been constant chopping and changing. Quangos have come and gone. The rules and regulations have come and gone. And in general, particularly in the last few years, the numbers of young people doing apprenticeships, which I think is a very valuable way into work, has fallen really quite catastrophically. The apprenticeship levy, which was the latest sort of scheme, was introduced in 2017, and the numbers since then are absolutely terrible. The number of apprenticeships in total are down 31%. The number of young people doing apprenticeships, that's down 34%. The number of people doing level 2 apprenticeships, quite basic apprenticeships, that's down a sort of 73%. And to get right through to a very good question from Susanna, the number of people doing apprenticeships in small and medium-sized enterprises, small businesses, is down nearly 50%. That accounts for nearly all of the decline in apprenticeships. This is a potentially really important field which has gone horribly wrong. Not through bad intention on the part of the people that designed the system, not through bad intention on the part of employers, but it's complicated to navigate. It's the message isn't getting through to learners, it's not getting through to schools, and it's a thing that really does need fixing.
I mean, do we know? I mean, how do we do that? I mean, what would it take for the government to really encourage or convince that small employers that they should be increasing apprenticeships rather than cutting them?
I had a feeling you might ask that. And some things are happening. The government is kind of talking about and is partly introducing some quite important changes. It's facilitating shorter term apprenticeships, so apprenticeships that last for less than 12 months. It's loosened the existing requirements for attainment in English and maths for young people. It's loosened the restrictions on the growth and skills fund. That's the pot of money where all of this funded, so that now half of that fund goes to apprenticeships, half of that can go to other training courses. So all of that is beginning to help. But in my opinion, more needs to be done. And in particular, we need, I think, to simplify the pathways for employers. And I think actually, and this is going to sound quite crude, I think we need to offer incentives to help employers, particularly SME employers, to take on apprentices. And I think the money has to come from somewhere. And I would do this by actually increasing the apprenticeship levy, which at the moment is 0.5% of payroll costs over 3 million. If you just edge that up very slightly, you start to create the kind of funds that would enable us to put to encourage employers, particularly small and medium-sized employers, to put more into apprenticeships.
So I think if you take this from the employer's perspective, what we've seen, as Philip says, is that particularly these lower level apprenticeships are where there's been a bigger problem. Employers are relatively more attracted to these higher level apprenticeships. And part of that has got to be just that you have more information at the time you're recruiting that apprentice. If they're coming in with something that looks a little bit more like qualifications from school that you understand and you can value, and you can get a sense of whether this is somebody who you want to make a commitment. When apprenticeships work well, the way that model works well is you bring on somebody who has potential needs training, you invest in them potentially for a good chunk of time. It's not just money, it's not just their salary cost, it's the cost of the manager who's looking after them, it's the cost of the colleagues around them who are developing them. So you put a lot of investment into this person, and you hope that that's going to build you up a worker who's useful to you and who's going to have a long-term relationship with your firm. That's the goal. But that also means that initial decision, there's a lot of pressure on that initial decision of who do you want to bring on? Who do you want to offer this to? And so trying to get that right and trying to make sure that firms are not just looking at this and saying, well, now I have more flexibility in my growth and skills levy, I'm going to rebadge my executive MBA program as an apprenticeship for my executive, but that they're really using that to take a chance on people and bring people in at the bottom end of the scale. That's, I think, where there's a trickier question of getting the incentives right in this world where employers and everybody have what we would call incomplete information.
Yeah, if I could just come in on that, Christine, I agree entirely. And I mean, something that a lot of people are advocating is actually restricting apprenticeship funds to non-degree holders. That starts to point the kind of the laser at the area of the market which needs addressing.
So perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the questions we got are not about formal education or attainment of young people. They are about the broader lives and well-being of our nation's children. And to tackle those questions, I'm joined again by Anne Longfield, who is Executive Chair and Founder of the Centre for Young Lives and former Children's Commissioner for England. So thank you, Anne, for coming back. I'm going to kick off with a question that we had from David Gregson of Be Well, which is a programme that was developed in response to a concern about young people's well-being. And among other things, they run a survey of well-being. David wrote to say, Be Well analysis shows that socio-economic disadvantage, school belonging and mental health and well-being are among the most important influences on both school attendance and suspensions. What should we do to address the issues that the Be Well research makes so clear and to ensure that more young people are in school and staying school? So, Anne, what do we do to make sure that we're addressing these issues?
Well, it's a big issue of our time is school attendance, and absenteeism from school was rocky boosted by COVID. At its peak, it was 23% of children who were persistently absent. That's one day every fortnight. It's down to about 18-19% at the moment, but it's still much higher than it was. And David's right in that, if you look at the reason children aren't in school on those times, you will see that mental health issues have a really high rating there. Also, children who are living in poverty are much more likely to not be in school. So this is far beyond just kind of sending letters or issuing fines, if you like, for young people and families. Some of the schools and local areas that are really sort of starting to tackle this in a very positive way are really looking at, again, providing family support for those families to really being able to help them see schools as being very important, see schools as being something that they are part of and help them help their children back into school, but also for children and young people, that real sense of belonging. And belonging is something which is coming to the fore really as obviously so important. If you think about all of us, we want to feel we belong wherever we are, whether it's work or a home, in the community. And a lot of children just haven't felt that school is for them in many ways, especially as it's become much more kind of focused on academic achievement. It's become, many of the process and behavior systems have become much more, some way times punitive. And those kids who maybe aren't naturally aiming for or able to achieve some of those academic outcomes, I think just look at school and think, well, this is for other kids, not me. And that is something that, in every way limits not only those kids' opportunities, but also all of our opportunities kind of as a wider society. So having good things that are going on in school, enrichment outside school, so all kids have things that they, want to go to school for, really working with kids to actually help them build their confidence to be able to return into school, but also ongoing pastoral support, really, to be able to help those children who are struggling. And often that'll be tackling the issues that are going on in their wider life or at home. And sometimes really seeing huge results from youth workers that are working with them. So these are problems that aren't going to go away by themselves. Really important work going on to overcome them. And having well-being, which is a core priority for the school, alongside that academic achievement, is really where we need to get to as well, which is why the work of Be Well is really important.
Christine, you've been nodding along vigorously to all that.
So I think one kind of point that Anne made there, which is something that we talked about in some of the earlier episodes, when I started working on education, one of the stats I found most shocking was that if you look at a child who at the age of 11 is not achieving their expected milestones, it's like pretty much certain, like I'm talking 95% probability that child does not go on to achieve good GCSE benchmarks. And so I think you have a lot of 11 to 16-year-olds, like Anne says, sitting there in school thinking, well, the stats say I'm not going to meet the mark on these exams. Everyone keeps telling me how important these exams are and keeps trying to tell me if, just work hard, just do more. But for most of these kids, that's not working, or that doesn't seem to be realistic. And so if that's the backdrop that you're working against, and this is not a small fraction of the population, if that's the backdrop you're working against, it becomes really hard to see school as an environment where you feel a sense of belonging, or you feel like you're doing a lot of important work and you have something achievable to work towards. I think when we look at the question that David sent in and we try and link this to some of the factors he's identified, we think a lot about socioeconomic disadvantage. We measure that really well in the data. We are increasingly thinking about mental health. That's still not particularly well measured in many forms of data, but we're starting to build up a better picture. School belonging is really the one that's kind of the newest kid on the block. And in some sense, it's the one that's hardest for researchers to get a handle on, because there's not really any substitute for that other than going and asking the kids directly. I think when we do that, and we brought some of this up in the schools episode with Sam, when we do that, we see that actually, and a very small share of young people say that they feel very unsatisfied with their school lives, but that's been increasing really rapidly, and it's now about 1 in 10 feeling really unsatisfied with their life at school. And that should raise questions, because we know that for many kids, school is a place of safety. It's a place where they get lots of input and lots of investment, and they feel calm and confident in that environment. But for many kids, school is also a source of stress if they have a really chaotic classroom and kids who are bullying them or acting out all the time, or even at slightly older ages, those threats of violence. So getting that environment right, both in terms of the academic side and what's an appropriate, achievable, realistic target, but also in terms of the wider environment of, do these kids feel calm and safe and happy and like they can be themselves in school? Both of those are really important pieces of this.
Yep. And picking up on the mental health part of that, obviously there are some issues in the school environment, but lots of people were engaging with this and talking about all the things outside of school that are affecting mental health. Social media came up a lot, but one that struck us was, so the Youth Sports Trust wrote in saying the following: we know the roaming radius of children has reduced dramatically over the last 100 years. Unstructured and unsupervised play has been eroded from childhood by a shift to overparenting and shorter play times. Time spent in active fun and games has been displaced by online gaming and social media. And over 40,000 hours of physical education have been lost from the school curriculum since London hosted the Olympics and Paralympic Games in 2012. So a question that I'll come to you on, Anne. What are the consequences of changing lifestyles among young people, and particularly this role of reduced physical activity and sport on the development of children?
Those figures are really stark. The distance of travel from home that's referred to there, 100 years ago, it was 6 miles for an 8 or 9-year-old. Now, that's a long way for us now, right? 6 miles from home. Would you let your child go? Probably not. By 1970, it got down to 1 mile. 1990, it was half a mile. Now it's 300 yards or the end of the street. And if you ask most parents, they'd say, I wouldn't send my child to the end of the street. The gate might be the thing.
Oh, no, I'm one of those parents.
But, you can see the difference, that whole lives have been shrunk, if you like, in terms of children's agency of being by themselves, their independence, their view of being part of the community. All of those things have shrunk over the last 100 years, and for a whole range of reasons. The outside world's got faster, busier, more uncertain, all those things. And of course, social media has come along with an alternative. Now, just as we know that there are huge benefits for children being outside, playing, active in terms of health, in terms of mental health, well-being and the like, we know adventure play particularly is helpful in terms of reducing depression and anxiety. It's also through play that kids learn how, their place alongside other kids, how to negotiate, how to make social networks, how to, get over difficulties. And what we've seen, of course, especially over the last 10 plus years, is the growth of screens as an alternative. We know most of that time, fun though it can be, is also sedentary, in isolation, and too often doom scrolling, with kids now spending, teenagers, up to 10 hours a day online. So, the difference, of course, is all about getting, making the most of the opportunities, the huge opportunities in the digital world, of course. But we don't want that to consume everything, because it brings difficulties in itself. So getting that balance where we can help children to get the best possible outcomes for being online and everything that brings, but also have real opportunities in real life in the community. And that's as much as being able to have safe places to play, great activities going on, or actually look, if we can get to the point, was where some of our European neighbours are, where they've built communities around the needs of children to be kind of physically active, physically engaged in the community, and communities that actually represent children as kind of core members of society. There's a lot to do about this, and obviously there's a great draw that social media has, but I do think we need to put a priority in helping kids get active, being part of life, yes, in school, but also in their time out of school as well.
And actually, that links wonderfully to a bunch of other questions we've had about the role of play. And actually, as an example of that, a commentator on Mumsnet asked, what is the evidence on the role of play in early childhood development and education? And how does the push for earlier formal learning in England compare with the more play-based approaches in other European countries? I mean, are we downgrading the role of play too much over here?
Well, the many other countries have put play absolutely first, especially in terms of early learning. Actually, in Sweden recently, they did downgrade it slightly, or seem to downgrade play slightly. Of course, we all want our kids to be able to achieve in terms of, their kind of academic achievement, their learning and the like. But play is the way that children learn. It's the way that they experience the world around them, the way they make sense of the world around them. And if we start to either, restrict that, and there's been restrictions in playtime as well when children get into primary school, if we restrict it, or we don't allow children to, follow those mediums to learn and develop, it does have a big impact on their experience of learning, but also their cognitive and social and emotional development. This is what putting the foundations for learning into place in the early years is all about. And play is absolutely children's work in those early years.
I think that's exactly right. And I think the weight of expert consensus very much agrees that, particularly in those earliest years of life, play is incredibly important for children's development. I think it's useful to distinguish between different kinds of play when we tackle this question. So there's play that adults get involved with, and that can have a kind of developmental angle to it. That could be, here I am folding the laundry. Can my kid match the 2 red socks together? And can my kid help me fold the socks together? And all of a sudden you're doing colors and you're doing shapes and you're doing physical activity and manipulating objects. So that's a kind of quite developmentally directed form of play. The other end of the spectrum is totally free play, where you just put some kids together, or you have your one kid on their own and you just let them go and see what comes out of that. And the reason it's important to make that distinction is because it also comes back to the resources and the environments that children find themselves in. We talked on the previous episode about the incredible amounts of time that parents are spending with their kids and how quickly that's been increasing. If those parents are stressed and they're feeling that there's a lot of to-dos to tick off the list, and there's a lot of sort of what they view as basics and fundamentals to just get through, that is going to squeeze the capacity that they have to let loose and have a slightly freer flowing version of play. And equally, if we're seeing that particularly the most disadvantaged children are not starting in formal childcare settings as early as their peers will be under the government's new childcare entitlements, and there's been a closure of some of these community spaces like places like Sure Start, where they would go out and interact with other kids of that same age group, that's going to hamper the opportunities for kids to interact with each other in those freer form settings. So we do need to think about that. I will say that the early years curriculum is not intended to be, let's have all the 2-year-olds sit at their desks and form their letters together. It is a play-based curriculum, but getting that balance of both the kind of directional play, the free play, and also the physical play that we talked about in the previous question, and developing those gross motor skills to be able to hold a pencil or sit at your desk and sit straight and look at the teacher. All of those are important, and we need to be thinking about the spectrum of play in them.
So sadly, we're going to have to draw this episode to a close soon, although I'm tempted to keep going with the questions. Shall we end on the question that I really started with for the whole of the start of this series, where I really wanted to ask, are the nation's kids okay? And I spoke about that with all of the experts we've had on this series. And I think of all of them, Sam was perhaps the most optimistic, highlighting that has been some good news. So here's what he had to say.
Are the kids okay? A lot of kids are okay. I don't think we should get too pessimistic. I think, we, as we talked about when I came on before, there were some real big successes in our education system. We are one of 3 countries in the world where 16 to 24-year-olds have seen improvements in the last decade in terms of numeracy and literacy. This is a big win. Yes, there are some real issues around mental health. There are issues about the most vulnerable young people at the bottom who are being sort of cut off by the welfare system, by more extreme poverty. So there's not that there aren't real problems. But I would say that when I spend time in schools and when I talk to kids, that's probably the most hopeful I ever am at the moment about the state of this country. I'm more worried about the adults than the kids.
Well, I guess that's good news, because the kids will become the adults. But I think all of the experts also reflect that while there are some children who are absolutely okay, they're thriving, they're doing well, they have great opportunities, there are still very many children for whom that isn't true. So, Christine, what's your take? You've been through this whole series. Are the kids okay?
I've been really struck by the minority, but the very chunky minority across so many of the outcomes that we've been talking about, whether it's good level of development, whether it's special educational needs, whether it's GCSE results, whether it's absences, whether it's mental health, whether it's children in social care, whether it's crime. All of these areas, you're getting somewhere between 25 and 30% of kids who seem to have really bad outcomes or seem to be facing really big challenges. And that's a big group of society. Now, those are not going to be necessarily the same kids hitting all of those different outcomes, but there's going to be a lot of overlap. And to me, that speaks to the importance of, number one, thinking about this holistically. This is not just any one government department's problem. This is not just, education will sort out education and justice will sort out youth offending and somebody else will sort out housing policy. But no, we really need to think about this in the round. But it also means to me that we need to be thinking about this throughout children's lives. And I think that point of it's not one stage of education. Earlier intervention can make a really big difference, but it's not ever going to be enough on its own. And we can't ever allow ourselves to think, oh, we'll just do early years and we can avoid all of these other things down the line. And the final point I'd make is, 25 to 30% is a lot. It sounds like a really basic point, but it's a lot. I think people often come at this and think of this as maybe the 5 to 10% most disadvantaged, the really, really struggling, the really obviously struggling kids. And I think we need to widen that lens a little bit and remember that actually this is a bigger group with more profound difficulties and challenges than I think often many people appreciate.
Yeah, and I think if I was stepping back and thinking about things I've learned across these series and the kind of themes that come out for me, I obviously went into this worrying that the kids weren't okay, and I'd seen a bunch of statistics that made me think that actually there were some children who were struggling. I'm a little bit surprised at quite how complex it is. And actually, obviously there is some overlap in which children are struggling, but actually lots of children are struggling for different kinds of reason. And there'll be some children who are growing up in poverty, who are struggling with their education and well-being. And at every stage of life, you look at them, they're struggling. But there'll also be some children who might be looking okay for a while, but then they get to GCSEs, they just miss their C, and then they're locked out of opportunities. Or, there'll be some children that were doing okay in their early life, and then they have mental health problems in later life. So actually, in some sense, I'm a bit more concerned than I was maybe at the start, because it's not as simple as that there is a set of children who are struggling early and continue to struggle, they're there. But actually, there are many more children who at some point are struggling with something and are struggling with lots of different things. Some of them are struggling with stuff that I'm still a bit shocked about, honestly, stuff about, can they hold a pencil? Can they take themselves to the toilet when they're very young? Can they have basic reading and writing skills? Some of them are struggling with complex mental health issues. There's a whole range of things that are really materially affecting children's lives. In some sense, it's a much more complex picture than I perhaps expected. And I think that speaks to what you said there about, what we haven't unearthed on this podcast, unsurprisingly, is the magic bullet, the kind of, here's what you do. Because there isn't a here's what you do in a single sense. There's the development, the investment in early years, which you've absolutely convinced me is key, because you've set out really nicely, Christine, that you take a child at 5, you look at their outcomes, and that is so predictive of the rest of their lives. It has to be right that you intervene early, but it's not enough. You've got to keep going throughout child life. So I think that complex picture and that need to join up policy is something I really take away from our discussions.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, children's lives are children and young people's lives. They're messy and they're complex and there's a lot going on. And in some sense, why wouldn't there be? I mean, adults' lives are messy and complex and there's a lot going on. So all of these events, all of these occurrences that happen to people throughout their lives, that's always going to be the case. There are always going to be bad shocks that come along. There's always going to be somebody who has a bad piece of news or suffers an adverse experience. What matters is what systems we have in place in the home, in the family, in the school system, in the wider set of the kind of public services and wider society, but also in that child or young person themselves, what resilience they have, what social and emotional and grit, what kinds of skills they've got to be able to pick themselves up and keep going. All of those different factors matter. And what we need to do is think about how can we build resilience and how can we build support and a safety net that's there to catch people when these inevitable buffets come along and hit their lives. And how can we, the flip side of that is how do we not do what we're doing now, which is allow some of those negative shocks to become baked in and put somebody permanently on a lower trajectory or reduce their outcomes kind of in a permanent way on the basis of one bad shock at one point in time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I was thinking in preparation for finishing this series about what I thought needed to happen next. And of course, we've talked a lot in this series about all the different ways in which children might be struggling, and mental health and wellbeing have come through loud and clear through lots of what we've talked about, and about that, the sense of belonging and the sense of just children needing to feel okay. And we've talked about all sorts of policy levers that governments might use, right from what you do when babies are born through to how you help young adults transition to the working life, and whether that be direct tax and benefit policies, whether it's family hubs, all sorts. We've covered a huge amount of ground. One thing that strikes me and think that what else I'd like to know is that I'd actually like us to know, I mean, us society as opposed to just us IFS, or maybe we can do the evidence base here, but what is it really that's driving some of the changes we've seen? So we've seen some good things, increasing average educational attainment, but also increasing the number of children who are getting to school just not with some basic skills, and increasing the number of children with mental health problems. And we've touched on bits of that. People quickly point to social media or to children's lives becoming geographically smaller and having fewer interactions with the outside world. So I think we have bits and pieces about what's really changing in children's lives over time. But to my mind, I think it would be good to know more about things like, why are we having more children with special educational needs and disabilities? Of course, once we have them, we have to do all the things we've talked about to try to make that system work and to support those children. But I'm interested in, as we go forward, taking this conversation forward, stepping back and asking, well, why, what is changing really in society? That's not about an individual family. It's about what is happening more broadly to these children, and how can we be more preventative in future before we even get the next generation of children? What can we do in our society to set up society in a way that we don't have children who are struggling in the next generation?
Yeah, and I think that prevention point is for me the biggest theme that's come out of this podcast. I am an early years person by trade, by choosing, and I went into some of the later episodes when we talked to Sam or when we talked to Philip Augar about kind of later stages of education, expecting that those conversations would very much focus on what do we do about post-16 or what do we do about the school system. But pretty consistently throughout that, everybody kept coming back to the early years and kept coming back to this question of prevention. Now, we've said this before, and I think we need to be really clear that prevention is never going to solve all of these problems, but a combination of prevention and detection and figuring out what actually works to support these families becomes really important. And I think the challenge there, or the goal that researchers should be setting themselves there, is that we cannot allow poor evidence to contaminate this. This is too important, and we need to be holding ourselves to a really high standard to make sure that we're getting the best evidence we can on what actually is it that works. Because these are huge and complex questions, and there's not ever going to be one silver bullet that says just do this program or just give families cash or just invest more in the health service. It's always going to be across all of the set of things that government does and that wider society does, which is in some sense encouraging, because that means that we're not wasting loads of money and doing lots of stuff that doesn't benefit anybody. But it also means that on all of these fronts, there's room for us to innovate and there's room for us to improve.
Yeah, and I think alongside that, I'd say, I think we also need to be really clear-sighted about the fact that we're going to have as a society some difficult conversations, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a grandparent, an auntie, just a citizen who cares about the future. I mean, some difficult conversations about how best to support young people, whether it's early years or whether it's people with special educational needs, or it's teenagers that are in crime, or it's just people who are who are struggling in school and don't really get much help moving into the working life. These are big emotional topics about, family life and what you do at home is a big thing. So I think we have to also, all of us, be willing to talk about these issues and just imagine that there is a better way possible. And on that, maybe that's a good place to draw to a close this series. A huge thank you to everyone who sent in their questions and to all of our amazing guests. A special thanks to Christine, who has been absolutely amazing. Behind the scenes, she has done a huge amount of work to make this series possible, and I've learned a huge amount. So thank you, Christine. If you've enjoyed this series, please do subscribe to the IFS Zooms in your podcast app and share it with anyone who might be interested. And if you'd like to support our work, you can become a member for as little as £10 a month. You can just check the link in the episode description. But thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.